So, hi everybody, my name is Heather Whalley and I'm a reader in neuroimaging at the University of Edinburgh. Thanks to Hilary for mentioning some of those. I'm going to cover some of the same topics in the talk. So I'm going to talk about the brain and its development across adolescent period. And this has only really been possible because of the many young people around the world who've spared their own time to have a brain scan or even repeated scans, so that we can really understand at greater and greater depths nuances of brain development over this period. So starting with adolescence. So adolescence is defined as a transition between childhood and adulthood. And we all know that it's a period of huge physical, social, cognitive and emotional change, and importantly, changes to the brain, which I'll come on to shortly. And it's also a period of change for the parents. So I have two teenagers at home, and this quote really resonated with me. So adolescence is a period of rapid changes. Between the ages of 12 and 17, for example, parents could age by as much as 20 years. It's also a period that tends to be generalized and parodied in society and in the media. But it's important not to underestimate not just the challenges of this period, but also, importantly, the opportunities that it also presents. And it's only really very recently, with the advent of new neuroimaging tools and their much more widespread use, that we know that there are important brain changes that occur throughout adolescence, and in fact well into the mid-20s, as individuals transition to independence and maturity. And it's now beginning to be considered as the second period of brain development after changes that happen around the time of birth and in early childhood. So almost being considered as a second window of opportunity to potentially avert negative trajectories. So in fact, myself and other members of my lab and other researchers at the university were recently invited to assist the Scottish Government with a review of this recent literature of brain changes across adolescence. And we were able to bring all of this evidence together into a summary that we shared with the Scottish Government and the Scottish Sentencing Council. And after public consultation, this research actually brought about policy changes for the sentencing of young people between the ages of 16 to 25, so that there was an emphasis away from imprisonment and more towards rehabilitation in this age group, exactly because the brain has not reached its optimal level of maturity, and there is a significant opportunity for change and the potential for rehabilitation in this age group. So most changes in the brain over this period occur in a region that's at the front of the brain called the prefrontal cortex. And it's a region that's involved in decision-making, planning, inhibiting inappropriate behavior, and understanding the consequences of our actions, along with supporting mature social behavior and the understanding of the self and others. And the prefrontal cortex is actually one of the last regions to mature. And on the right panel, we can see how the prefrontal cortex changes with age, where age is shown in years on the horizontal axis, and the frontal grey matter volume is shown on the vertical axis. And we can see from the figure that the prefrontal volume peaks. It reaches its maximum where the black arrow is, which is around 10 to 12 in girls, a little later in boys. But you'll also notice that after this maximum volume is reached, the brain volume doesn't then plateau, it actually starts to decrease. There's a slight decline at the end. And that's okay. In fact, it's more than okay. It's a normal and beneficial part of brain development. So we're born with many more connections than we actually need. And this period of decline in adolescence represents a normal type of development called synaptic pruning, which Hilary mentioned, and that starts in adolescence. But importantly, until very recently, we didn't know that it continues right through into the mid-20s. So here, synapse refers to the connections in the brain, and pruning means just that, removing the connections that aren't needed and aren't being used. And the way it works is that the synapses that are being used a lot are strengthened, and those that are not being used are pruned away. It's the age-old use it or lose it type scenario. So connections and pathways that are in common use are strengthened, and the weak connections and pathways that are surplus to requirements are pruned away. And another process that's happening at the same time is something called myelination, and it refers to the formation and maturation of the fatty-like insulation around the wiring of the brain, and it's a bit like the insulation around electrical wiring. So it makes the electrical signals between neurons travel faster and more effectively. And both of these processes, both synaptic pruning and myelination, are still occurring right through adolescence into the mid-20s. And they work together to make the brain function more efficiently, supporting the formation of mature adult-level complex mental and social functioning. But there's another important point on the flip side of this that I think is worth mentioning. So it relates to the fine-tuning of brain maturation over adolescence. So this brain remodelling that I've just spoken about is based on which connections are being used. So these are the ones that are strengthened, and those that are not being used are weakened, they're weakened and removed. And this in turn is dependent on the individual's environment, interests, their experience, their strengths, their likes, their dislikes. So it's important to see adolescence as a critical period, as an opportunity where the environment and an individual's experience contributes to the fine-tuning of brain development and maturation. And in that way, adolescence represents a tremendous potential to embrace and guide experience-driven brain remodelling to support future adult functioning. We know this period of development, as mentioned, is associated with certain teenage characteristics. So teenagers, as we all know, are often seen as self-focused, moody, self-conscious, sensitive to social and emotional aspects of life. And it's these features that are thought to be related to differences in how the timing of different parts of the brain mature, which I've represented here using the unbalanced weighing scales or the mismatched weighing scales. So I mentioned before that the prefrontal cortex and all its important higher order cognitive thinking functions is the last to develop. But amongst the earliest to mature are those regions involved in emotion and reward processing. And it's thought that it's this mismatch in the maturation of these networks that underlies why teens don't always think through the consequences of their actions. They can be impulsive, they can take risks that other older people might not, simply because they're being driven by these highly firing reward and emotion regions. And the thinking regions aren't yet fully mature enough to balance this out. So as a parent, we might say, what were they thinking? But in actual fact, they probably weren't thinking in the same way that we might. They're being driven by these other networks that are so excitable during adolescence. So I'd like to talk briefly about the important area of adolescent mental health, which is the main focus of my research. So along with the adolescent period being important for higher maturation of the brain, the second peak of brain development, as we've seen, it's long been known that this peak is also a peak period for the onset of mental health problems, shown in the graph, including things like anxiety, mood disorders, schizophrenia. And in fact, around 80% of all adult mental health conditions have their origins in adolescence. So these disorders, these problems are emerging over this period of fine-tuning of brain development. And as a field, we think this is unlikely to be a coincidence. So one way we were interested in investigating this is to see what was happening in the brain when teenagers are feeling some of these typical adolescent behaviors that have been associated with longer-term risks for mental health problems. And one of those behaviors is irritability. So irritability is defined as the excitability to annoyance, impatience, or anger. And it's an important potential early sign of problems in mood regulation. It's been shown that it can be a risk factor for mental health problems across a number of different mental health diagnoses. And I say can because we really don't know in the field as yet how to define the boundaries of normality in normal teen behavior. So anyway, to investigate irritability, we looked at the literature to see how it had been studied before. And what we found was that in order to tap into these types of behaviors, researchers had asked adolescents to do things like solve impossible mathematical equations that were just not solvable. Now, that might be very frustrating to some, but we felt that teenagers might just not engage with it at all. So we wanted to develop something new that could be used in the MRI scanner and that was more relevant and valid and appealing to teenagers, and ideally didn't involve maths. So we started from scratch by asking young people themselves to help us design our study. And we conducted a survey designed by the teenagers themselves, asking other teenagers what made them irritable. And you can imagine we got quite a lot of feedback. And we then asked a separate group of teenagers to rate how irritating they found these scenarios. And here are some of the irritating scenarios that they mentioned. So I find it irritating when my parents tell me to do something multiple times that I've already agreed to do, or when the Wi-Fi drops unexpectedly and I was watching something. and when people eat with their mouths open. So we then asked our research sample, when they were in the MRI scanner, to read, to think, and imagine that they were experiencing these irritable scenarios while they were having the scan. And what we found was that there was the network properties or features of a region called the anterior cingulate cortex differed in relation to the levels of irritability that the young people experienced, shown in the graph at the top. So the anterior cingulate is a region at the front of the brain, shown in the blue circle, but unlike the other regions I was talking about earlier, it's actually in the midline where the two hemispheres meet at the front. So what we found was that young people with low irritability ratings had a network shown on the left, where the anterior cingulate was part of a strong, widely interconnected network of regions with relatively balanced inputs from many other regions. But in young people with high irritability ratings, the anterior cingulate was a very dominant player over a much less widespread and quite fragmented network. And this is interesting because the anterior cingulate is a unique region that functions at the interface between emotional and cognitive regions, if you think back to the slide with the mismatched scales. So this tells us that the network properties of the anterior cingulate that functions at the interface between cognitive and emotional regions is perhaps not able to kind of facilitate that balance. So somebody with high irritability ratings, perhaps the connections between the anterior cingulate aren't able to engage the thinking regions in order to rationalize the frustration. So finally, I'd just like to share one last piece of work. And it kind of fits in with what I was saying about understanding the boundaries of normality. And because there are this increasing amount of brain imaging data that's now being shared across the world, researchers are now interested in bringing together all this new data to develop normative growth charts for the brain. So many of you will be familiar with children's growth charts for things like height and weight that have been used now for many years in medicine to track the development of children and to spot those that might need some support, investigation, or intervention. So these brain growth charts would be very similar, but instead of height or weight, they would relate to different types of brain features. And this might be really important for future neurological and psychiatric research. And I think this is a really exciting development, and we'll have to really watch this space to see how it's taken up. But we also need to be aware of the importance and representation of inclusion within these charts. So most of the research that goes into these types of charts are from research studies, and research studies are typically biased in the selection of individuals that they scan. They tend to be European ancestry, they tend to be highly educated and relatively well off. And as we saw from James's talk about social deprivation, these factors are very important to bear in mind. So to summarize this section of the talk, so there are excitingly increasing amounts of brain data over adolescence, which has allowed us great progress in our understanding of adolescent brain maturation. We now know that it's a significant period of brain development, which matures right up until the mid-20s, and that mismatches in maturation between brain regions can underlie some of the characteristic features of adolescent behaviour. And we're beginning to explore these in more depth in relation to mental health problems. But critically, it's an important period of opportunity to embrace experience-driven brain remodelling, allowing individuals to thrive. And finally, going forward, we need to extend these imaging studies to include much more diverse populations than those that are typically included in imaging studies, to ensure that this research is truly representative and relevant for everybody. So to draw this whole lecture to a close, so as we've seen across all of the talks, it's important to think of the brain as an organ that's dynamic, it's changeable, and adaptable to experiences and the environment, not necessarily predetermined to any fixed trajectory. And that's not to say that we understand all these complex relationships, but there's a tremendous opportunity to support individuals to find their passions, provide supportive environments, and support them to thrive while welcoming their own individuality. It really does take all kinds of minds. Thank you.